Hello everyone, today we talk about the formation of the Roman state in the Archaic era, which is connected to topics that we started to discuss from some month. We began with the patricians and the plebeians, and more recently with the Archaic Roman combat, and more in general with in this background of creation for our channel's bias of the Roman army as we know it fundamentally, and we have already seen how the Roman history that we traditionally talk about before, essentially the 70s or the 3rd century BC, is largely fundamentally the fruit of a much later historiography, right? That mixes a little bit myth with reality, and that naturally was drawing the history of their own city. Well, this is what the same Romans not only actually will see, but still in a world ruled by Rome by that time. The much of the say tracing the origins of the political institutional system as it was known at the time in Rome, right, and naturally inserting much of this historical memory, right, of the Roman past that was surely known in a very different way today we do, like authors like Livy, even think about the same Roman emperors. We'll see how Claudius, for example, was a famous Etruscologist, we could say, surely knew much more than we do, but not quite in the rationalistic and properly historically scientific sense that we address today. And therefore, for a lot of time we went on with this essentially traditional telling of the story without stressing the story of Rome, archaic Rome, and even of the early republic at this point, actually, of which we haven't emphasized enough. Perhaps the kind of not just conjectural nature of in strictly historical terms, but properly the deeper meaning for an historiography of the 1st century BC, or right around there, because naturally there were further constructions on this. And this is particularly important because I presume everybody has studied Roman history in school, and starting from the origins, we give for granted, I don't know, the idea of the kings and the early republic, eventually, starting to see a bit more complexively and deeply into in fact, from the 3rd century BC, and however, not reasoning much on what that historical process has been built like. Right, and it's actually a very complicated business. First of all, because we have a very few certainties for a very long time, and in the teaching process, like in school, at least in secondary education, you begin maybe to address the thing in more complex matters. But don't think like not even a basic Roman history exam, at university is really expanding in this thing. It wasn't there for me. Like, you have to get a bit more interested in the thing. I did it amatorially. As you know, I'm a medievalist, but I still study ancient history with great pleasure. And sometimes I amaze myself looking at this story and this history, right, as two separated things, and realizing how much, first of all, we gave for granted about this history. Secondly, how much it influenced us actually as a culture in Western civilization, and secondly, why this happened. But from the other side, also how much positive information we can draw from the story, right, about mostly the cultural background, or even just in a broad sense, the politics, society, the military of Roman history. We can assess by a more just a deeper interest in these sources. I'm saying this because today we will not naturally dwell in the strictly philological problems of how and why we can talk about Roman history in the way we do. And today we will, differently from the last two videos, we will try to make a bit more of a traditional storytelling, that is to say, looking at what 1st century BC Roman authors such as Livy wrote about archaic times and the age of kings and the formation of the republic, and making an effort to read through it, and assessing other aspects that we can recollect just from, I don't know, archaeology, other a broader vision of the evidence that we have for a history of Rome at this point. So we talk about this process that is properly the one of a statal construction. In the last video about the Roman archaic combat, we have stressed essentially the clanic / even feudal character of Roman history of their origins, right? And when we talk about the origins, we're talking literally up to the beginning of the 4th century BC, right? So something that is actually very, very recent after all. And we will naturally talk about even the prehistory of Rome at some point. Today we stick essentially to the great Rome of the Tarquini and the creation of the Republic, and seeing mostly, however, under the so-called Etruscan kings, how Rome, would have allegedly acquired certain statal characters that today, historically speaking, we tend to attribute actually to a slightly later period that was connected with this one and had its own roots, definitely this one as well, and some of which very important, properly, political sense, but that actually happened in a much more gradual way, in fact, much later overall in the way we know it, right? So there is this general picture that we receive from Roman history, that is the important turning point of the so-called Etruscan domination, right? That is more than the foundation of a city, of the urbs proper, right? That even if this seems to have been of even of Etruscan influence, actually, my opinion, could be more easily tied to the Proto-Indo-European, right? Urbs, in this sense, is an enclosed area, right? The Proto-Indo-European verb, for example, means to enclose. The Umbrian Verfale means area for taking auspices. The Hittite Varpa, enclosure, or even the Tocharian A, Varpi, which means garden, Tocharian B, Vervie, meaning garden. So the idea of the city here is that we don't make it go as back as the foundation of the sacred enclosure, right, of the Pomerium that Romulus himself traced allegedly since the beginning, which is actually a real thing, right? It's part of the tribal culture of the times. But today we talk about this advanced stage, in which there is probably already a city that is beginning to be articulated in an organization, an orderly organization with specific administrative frames and political and social institutions. So this happens in a time in which Rome is already quite developed as a urban center. As you know, it was the major Latin city, was extremely well placed for trade in Italy and the Western Mediterranean. It was a great attractivity naturally of Rome herself, that had drawn in fact the Etruscans to assume at least not properly a domination. Like Rome was never concretely dominated by Etruscan. It was not like an Etruscan empire or an Etruscan occupation. There was rather a sort of hegemonization, which is maybe even a too big word, by the side of the Tarquinians, right? From Etruria, that were a noble family coming from the homonymous city of the Tarquinia, in fact, Traxuna, if I'm not wrong, this mysterious city, if you want. I mean, Tarquinia exists for beautiful ruins, and it's one of the most important Etruscan sites existing, but we don't know very much in this between myth and reality what the real connections were. But an Etruscan aristocracy at some point entered fundamentally in the Roman system. It was essentially like largely made up of Latin and Sabine aristocracy that accepted this inclusion actually within the Etruscan NATO relations. It included trade, like Etruria back in the day. It was one of the most advanced regions and cultures in the peninsula. It was at the center of very important traffics, mining. It had in fact developed this kind of properly political organization within cities. Think about the Decapolis. Nobody actually knows what all of the 12 cities were, and Rome so fit in this to enter into this system and to accept that an Etruscan aristocracy would fundamentally share that and have this role of probably even of not really of guardian, but let's say of arbiter or judge in the Roman affairs. We can't exclude actually a heavier intervention in the measure of likelihood of competition that in fact would take place with the same expulsion of the Tarquinians, which also in here we don't know up to which point it's really myth or legend, but there is a crisis at some point towards the end of the 5th century BC in the Mediterranean. The Etruscans lose it to Greek expansion at certain levels. There's the collapse of this broader net, and that's where the Roman aristocracy proper takes over once again, causing a lot of troubles that will actually expose, in fact, Rome to now the aggressive resurgence of the Latin and other Italic peoples that tried to conquer this main center in the lower Tiber Valley that had remained without Etruscan protection, right? And there is a deep internal struggle in Rome because the Roman aristocracy, that it's ultra elitary and absolutely aristocratic and warlike, in fact clinic feudal minded, absolutely has no initial interest in expanding, for example, the right of participating to the army for the rest of the people, right? That had largely increased and developed and even organized under Etruscan times, because the thing is a bit like this, that the Etruscan kings, as many kings, actually are not tyrants over the lower strata of the population. On the contrary, they use lower strata of the population to curb the oligarchy, right, the aristocracy proper, and this is something that evidently brought even to the same fall of the Tarquini themselves, and that, however, at a certain point will be needed, right, and that's where we have fundamentally during the 4th century the creation of the beginning of this under allegedly, at least mythologically, under Furius Camillus. Here, this is hotly debated whether he was an actual historical figure or not. Presumably he wasn't, but the Fasti, for example, are very well hinged on his figure, so it's very complicated. Maybe we'll see it another time. But that's when there is eventually a compromise, which is also the ones that sees, in fact, the plebeians rising to power next to, or at least, by the nobility, by the patricians, to hold, for example, the imperium and other important faculties that in Rome were naturally associated with the divine power as it was conceived. Like, the imperium could be possessed just by the elite, in the origin, right? Here there is a very different development that eventually will evolve not towards like a democratic phase of, the Roman Republic was never a democratic regime. Rome was never a democracy, never, ever, and not even Greece, except for some of the most radical events in Athens, but it was always an oligarchy, and very much so. Like, the Roman political and institutional culture is violently aristocratic. Like, there is no other room for for else, and we have seen this in the previous videos, and it will remain like that fundamentally throughout all Roman history. But there is definitely the expansion of, for example, of certain rights of vote to also to the people, right? And the construction of what tradition identified in this Servian reforms, right, that would have in fact occurred under the still in the age of kings, right? And that's where under Servius Tullius, that would have created what we think it was like, in fact, the Servian legion based on the relation between use of arms and political rights, and this is something that actually happened later, and it's difficult if you look at that video. In fact, on Patricians and Plebeians we explained this, and it's a bit complicated now to digress on it once again. We'll do it, recall it here and there, and therefore today we read it as if we were thinking it actually happened in Tarquinian times, but it actually came later. It was an internal Roman thing. It was triggered definitely by the development of the popular classes under the Etruscan kings that brought in a lot of technical, scientific, handcraft know-how. That think that Etruria in this sense was very advanced, and Rome owes an enormous lot. In fact, as a state to the Etruscan model, but still the thing didn't quite happen under the Etruscans, but later on, right? A few generations later, it at least began to happen in this sense. But the point here is to realize that this is in fact the traditional timeline is such, right? And that is this attempt from the Roman historiographers of the first century BC to make fit the this kind of harmonizing in kind of republican, true republican ideals that, as we have seen, were ultra oligarchic, especially by the first century BC. The republic was dead, quite simply, or at least was in irreversible necrosis. And the point was to justify the fact that the republican institutions, as they were known at the time, were established at some time, not by, let's say, the mere negotiation of the Roman aristocracy with the people, but simply that a king, in this continuity that they saw, in fact, as the Etruscan one had created and established properly as a state in Rome. And this is quite important because, as you understand, there is a good unbalancement between the timeline of events and also their, this kind of forced idea that the Republic was instated, whereas actually the Republic was instated not by kings but properly by the nobility, in the measure in which the Senate, the patricians, began to expand this prerogatives. And up to that time, they had tried to maintain under their exclusive control, right, as this major clans that were ruling the city, carrying out private wars, essentially doing whatever the hell they liked, at a certain point beginning to discipline themselves and to starting framing under their command this larger number of populace that in this regard were also, with the populace, right? That's an enormous deal. Nobody actually knows. There are essentially hypotheses in our reality that wasn't at all like a political one that we imagine, in the sense from from etymologically, but it was still a semi-tribal reality, even with the same Rome. We see that the same Romans were split in tribes, even administratively speaking, and politically speaking. So the question is still how to conceive this passage, and realizing that this the creation of an idea of central public authority of the Roman state was far to exist in times like in the 5th century or even 4th century, where this actually was beginning to work, right? And it was very gradual, and it took a lot of difficulty. Not much because there was as if there was a democratic push from the bottom. Absolutely not. Like most of the people actually were really fine with the previous system. The problem now was civil survival and eventually of expansion. That this very potentially gifted city had that point. And once again, today we will specifically not talk about it as it happened, but just looking at certain aspects of how the tradition wanted us to realize it happened, and trying to explain why. So the essential part in the foundation of the state is attributed, as we have seen, to the so-called Servian reforms, of which Livy and Dionysius of Halicarnassus have passed down to us a essentially precise frame. Right, so precise, in fact, that of the three Etruscan sovereigns, Servius Tullius is the one that we know better, right, is definitely the key figure here. And according to the legend, Servius was a foreigner, and even more, he was like an ex-slave. He's called servus proper, right? It's from the term serf proper. And this is already interesting because, first of all, he became son-in-law of Tarquinius Priscus, so the first Etruscan king, thanks to Tarquinius' wife, Tanaquilla, who was allegedly this energetic woman who, eventually would help him to raise to power. This is very interesting because already in the Roman kind of highly conservative and patriarchal and the oligarchic character of the Roman mindset, this corresponded to the injection of even more than just a popular, but probably even a servile element, right, in the Roman politics and institutions, thanks to the rise of a woman, of an Etruscan king, right? So just think it in the general balance of the Roman Republican ideals, like the idea that even the monarchy, aside from the one of the older kings that were revered in a proper Roman sense, was eventually seen naturally as an anti-republican model, right? Until it was an ancestral thing that one could remember back in the day. But the fact that this Roman state was properly introduced by a foreigner, by a foreign slave, helped by a king's wife, right, was like the mark of a scar that had happened somewhere in the oligarchic past of Rome, right? Even if the sources here, like Livy and Dionysius, are pointing out actually a positive thing that happened. In terms of the Servian reforms and the creation, think about even the Servian walls that were actually created later by the beginning of the 4th century BC. That's also another Roman thing, but it brought in the idea that after all, the Etruscan kings had been a big deal for Rome, and what probably lays behind this traditional view is the realization that the Etruscan kings that actually shared at the time, in many ways, the same elitistic, aristocratic ethos of the Roman aristocracy, as we've seen before, had, however, began to introduce this or give more power. Even I can say inadvertently, but unavoidably at some point, made grow the Tarquinian Rome, like as a center of artisans, of craftsmen, of architects, of people that really, Roman civilization owes a lot to the Etruscan one in this sense. Properly, the urban culture of Rome owes much to the Etruscan one, and that this, after all, since the 1st century BC was still technically reasoning with with a good idea of the Republic, as Rome would eventually keep doing, even under the so-called empire. Even there's an impropriety of definition in that regard. Is that the popular element, the plebeian element next to the patrician one, after all, had affirmed itself in a constructive fashion, right? It's not that these Roman historiographers were hiding actually the bitter struggles between patricians and plebeians, which in the timeline even predate this period, and that therefore they try in that sense to show as if that had always been sort of constitutive nature of the Roman political and social dichotomy, whereas there is no evidence of this right before. Like, Rome was ruled by, as we've seen, a feudal class, a clanic aristocracy of warriors. And that was it, right? And there was actually probably a great contempt towards the rest of the people, right? This was the norm of Europe, outside of the democratic experiments were starting to happen. By the way, and not even had been fully accomplished in Greece, right? So think about the rest of Europe in this sense had truly a tribal background. These areas of like the Italian Peninsula were actually growing because of abundance of demographic, economic resources, and fertile soil, mild climate, etc., and heading towards, like, think about the same goals that before the Roman conquest had, their own oppida, almost a proto-urbanization of some sort. So that was a direction, not theologically intended in this sense, but still something that cannot conceal, however, the largely tribal base of this reality. It naturally includes, at some levels, also the idea of equality, of egalitarianism, right? At least in the origin, the idea of the freeman, the idea that, as we will see now, the Romans, after all, had been, had stemmed from a bunch of conquerors that had come, have won, had deserved the divine glory of the skies, and had even founded sacredly this place. So absolutely, like in many other tribal peoples, and we discussed it at length in other videos. And so for other historiographers, and in particular for the Etruscologist Claudius, the same Roman emperor that in fact was a specialist in Etruscan history, Servius Tullius was instead essentially a condottiere, right? Baby Etruscan and known as Mastarna, right? That etymologically speaking is connected to the Latin Magnus, right? The great, it's been translated sometimes even as the, or even, I don't know, I think from the same Claudius as dictator in Latin. So addressing at that point in fact a republican magistracy that in that times that didn't quite exist as such, or at least it indicates in that context rather like a military commander that rules with iron fist, right? It would have been allegedly friend of the princes of Vulci, and that would have become the Lord of Rome after having knocked out the party of the Tarquinians themselves, right? So this is even a deeper and kind of more, even antiquarian, but still, interesting interpretation from Emperor Claudius that perhaps is closer to reality than we think, in the sense that, as we've seen before, this Etruscan nobility that came to dominate within the Roman one was probably like, having this kind of warlike lifestyle, just like all the rest of the oligarchy, and imposing itself, even with this coups and exercise of violence, and even maybe with the complacency of part of the Roman aristocracy that maybe had a lot to share from it, right? And especially so much, in fact, that the same Roman historiography of so many centuries later sees in this, after all, in the Servian reforms, after all, a kind of a positive, event for at least for the sake of the development of the Roman institutions and so on, right? And in fact, this is properly the most important aspect, that to Servius Tullius is attributed the organization of Rome as a city, right? Politically and institutionally, right? This has nothing to do with the foundation of Rome, right? The ancestral thing that happened even there, probably much later than what Varro stated. That represents, as a foundation of a state, the most important phenomenon of Roman history of the 6th century. So let's give a look to what this Roman state, according to tradition, would have been. So there's a civic body, first of all, that is augmented and modified with the arrival of the Etruscans, that was distributed in tribus and curiae, right? So these systems probably existed as such already within the Roman and Latin systems. As we've seen, were essentially tribes in this council. So this is typical of a clanic society, after all. But what seemingly happened during Etruscan times is that this political system began to get more hierarchically organized, and that also began perhaps to include properly civic body of administrators, of experts, of people that, of skilled personnel coming from the more advanced, Etruscan cities that had literally the expertise and the know-how of how to even expand it, to invest in Rome, which was evidently the reason for Etruscan aristocrats to come in there in the first place, right? The city is rising fast already by itself. The Etruscans definitely accelerate the process. And here there is a first parallelism that we can trace essentially with the older Roman tribes, the one of ethnical characters that were established allegedly, and probably, at least in this traditional sense, much earlier, right? And we're talking, in fact, of famous Rhamnes, Titius, and Luceres, right? So these tribes are literally like almost an archetypical vision of what the Roman ancestral society was about, but they already contain even the integration of further elements. In a certain sense, they're properly an ethnic repetition. The Rhamnes were taking the name after Romulus, and therefore Rome in herself, and therefore were the Romans in a way, or at least the Latin element, like properly the local elements that had taken over the place where Rome was rising, right? And to Romulus, let's remember, it was associated not just simply the foundation of the city, but the fact that he had come to create the city as a conqueror, right? And that he had ravaged the neighboring tribes. He had asserted himself as the prototype of the chieftain that had been blessed by the military glory of the skies, and therefore was to found something sacred as the city of Rome and her institution. And so much that in an Indo-Europeistic perspective, Dumézil has even attributed to the Rhamnes as this ancestral tribe not just the political but also the religious primacy, right? Given that, as we explained many times, Rome, historically, but also in later times at the fullest of the empire, is founded exclusively, and I stress here exclusively, on a religious and not even military, but probably a religious/military base. Like there is no other possible foundation of a power in those times. Like Rome and all it represented in Western civilization, even eventually when it developed as a state, as the properly ecumenic empire we know, was based still at the time exclusively, not on rights, on law, civilization. No, it was based exclusively on a religious and military principle, right? And this is something that went on until the French Revolution. Like there was no other way of founding a power in this regard, if not in a divine fashion that entailed the rule of the communities and the exercise of justice. And then, of course, but primarily the first need of every society is to be pacified, is to be controlled in arms with so that everybody can at least start to do something, not just being scared to be killed from a moment to another. And so the Ramnes represent, Dumézil as an Indo-Europeist is, Indo-Europeistic is extremely fascinating, and it's probably been, overlooked after World War II because of the obvious associations, but the stressing of the Aryan thing and all in an ideological sense. But it's very important actually to recover. But the same Dumézil that studied for decades Roman history from a religious point of view, naturally also today is being corrected in some ways. So the idea that it was a tribe that detained properly the religious right here is probably never happened. Like if this happened, it was because it was connected to Rome as a community with certain families or groups probably had these prerogatives in a sense, but they were more shared than we can imagine. But the important here of these ancestral ethnical tribes is rather how Rome came to be composed as a community. And the second element is so important. In fact, the second and third actually are of foreign peoples, right? That definitely contributed to the creation of Rome, but properly that's the meaning. Like the Titius from Titus Tatius were properly the Sabines, right? Some people say, where were they actually? The agriculture, etymologically speaking, seems like they were the ancestors, like those who were seen perhaps in this, while Romulus was kind of the lead and the founder of Rome as such, and Rome as in this sense of a distinct identity, right? Not properly of just Latins, but of something more specific. The Titius maybe could represent the Sabines were actually settled within the same, circle of the Seven Hills of Rome. Like they were that close, geographically speaking. Etruria was just across the Tiber River. Like they were that close. They could represent more like the properly Italic background, like the idea, okay, we are Romans, but let's be aware that we're these other peoples here that we actually descend from as in a broader sense, right? It could be interpreted in this way. The Luceres said were the Etruscans, right? The root Luc stands from, for example, the Lucumo. It was the Etruscan king and higher religious office, right? The Romans had the Pontifex Maximus, right? But the probably in this phase was still a connection between the sacred, monopolium of the king, if you want. Probably not specifically in this case in Rome, because as we have seen, the Etruscans were just a part of, they weren't ruling everything. The rest of Roman aristocracy was pretty alive, and they naturally had their own local religious tradition and regulations. But Lucas, for example, is the sacred grove, right? And the connection here is definitely to the Etruscan element that contributed to build Rome. Probably here more in a perhaps in a hieratic sense, in a kind of the idea that the Etruscans, after all, were more advanced. They had their own powerful gods in a way or in another, so they were seen as a prestigious element of society next to properly Rome, other properly Latin or other Italic elements that made up the majority, naturally, of the Roman people. And then these foreigners that, however, were, hell of foreigners, so much that they became even kings of Rome themselves, and that are included in such. And the to the tradition of the first century BC attributes to Servius Tullius the creation, the passage, let's say better, from the three ancestral tribes of ethnic character to the new system, to the creation proper of the new system of territorial tribes, right? Which is something different. That is to say that what here are called allegedly Roman citizens, which they weren't technically at this time, but at least the Roman population found itself subdivided according to their domicile, right? And there were, in this Servian repartition, allegedly, this is all to the historiography, right? So we don't actually know, but the historiography attributes the beginning of this to Servius Tullius. So 4 urban tribes corresponding to the 4 regiones, the regions of Rome. There are the Palatina, Esquilina, Collina, and Suburrana. These are all areas of Rome still today. And then like a tent of rustic tribes distributed in the Roman territory. We could say the Roman district, the so-called Ager Romanus, so literally the Roman country, like the Roman countryside. And that naturally was this large fertile area of Rome that that the city controlled all around. And the number actually of the rustic tribes will increase eventually in Roman history with the expansion of Rome and the extension of the Ager Romanus. All these lands were in part confiscated to subjugated peoples, in so much that by the mid-3rd century BC, there would be 31 rustic tribes. So what's the deal actually, as we will see now, that the Roman territory is subdivided in districts that could be evidently organized in a better administrative sense, right? Because according to these reforms, all the citizens, starting from this moment, were allocated to one tribe, which, according to Dionysius of Halicarnassus, had to be domiciled and pay their taxes. So you perfectly understand what this is. Like, when we talk about the creation of a state, the first thing is, why is this happening? Is for collecting resources in a more rationalized and effective system. Basically, the Roman historiography attributed to the Servian times the creation, properly, as we will see now, of a census, right? Of a tracking down of all the Roman population, seeing how, where these groups lived, so that they could be, imposed the contribution to the state proper, right? This probably actually happened later on, right? And it's connected, as we see, to in fact, what is called as the Servian reform of the Roman army as well, was subdivided on the territorial base and required, in fact, democratic contribution to the Roman army. That is, how much do you have? Okay, so you have to serve with an equipment that is fitting to your level of wealth, right? So here, the system of the old curiae seemingly disappeared for a new social organization. This change seemed to have really happened later. As we have explained in Archaic Roman Combat, and also in the video we made on the Servian reform of the Roman army, actually to a later stage, to what we call conventionally as the Camillian reform, that would have taken place around essentially the first half of the 4th century BC. And that seems to have been actually the one where the Romans began to extend the rights, the political, the civil rights, we could say, anachronistically speaking, to the plebs, so that they could serve in the army. And this is corresponding, as far as we understand from a truly historical point of view, to the secondary phase in which the Tarquinians were already over, and the Roman nobility had attempted basically to maintain the same power in the city after it had expanded so much, and they couldn't provide effectively for the defense of Rome from her neighbors, so that they needed to bring the people, the plebs, to participate to the army, right? But as a consequence, also granting them some rights, and therefore creating this compromise that for their extremely elitistic edis was, must have been a truly revolutionary thing from their perspective, always given that it was actually a very gradual passage in many ways. So what's the social organization was attributed to the Servian reform according to historiography? So in origin were the system of the gentes, so this feudal clans of Rome was enforced. Each one of the ancestral tribes, of the 3 tribes, was subdivided in 10 curiae, right? So these tribes were, as we've seen, they're difficult to interpret as such. I mean, they didn't necessarily correspond to real tribes, but they were considered as large groups of peoples that organized themselves in these councils, and therefore participating to eventually to Senate, to this council of the chieftains, basically, of the clan leaders. And as a consequence, there were 30 curiae, each one with an individual name. And there is a system that is all based on numbers, that is due to Varro, as we're talking always about the 1st century BC, that was, obsessed by numbers, by ciphers, in many ways. And this, in fact, these numbers are too squared. So many historians say, this thing, together with all the rest, probably never quite happened with this dimension, but it still gives an idea of what the previous, the pre-state organization of Rome really was about. But what seems certain is that with this new change of the Servian reform, or whatever it was, that tended to integrate in the social body the new arrivals, right, from Etruria, however, even the local people. They were tied to this new form of economy. Essentially, they were artisans, merchants, right, substituted to the curiae organization a new system founded on the domicile and wealth, right? A state worth its name gives itself a territorial dimension and of control of the population, right? And this entails, as we said before, a census, in Latin, at least in classical pronunciation, a census. That is to say, in fact, a census of all the free citizens living within the Roman territory, and also of their respective goods, right? When before I was saying that we don't really know what the Roman people, the Roman freeman, or this alleged Roman citizen, anachronistically by this time would have been, is that we don't know, in fact, who actually participated to this new system and how, right? On which base, who were these people specifically, right? But it's obvious that the majority of the Roman of a tribal society is composed, aside from the slaves, naturally by freemen, so by people that naturally do not have as much power as the chief and the clan leaders, but they're in fact within those clans in a way or another, right? So even the struggle between the patricians and the plebeians has to do with properly this specific, even juridical difference that it's difficult to determine, right? Because the idea that it was kind of an ethnic separation between the original conquerors, the Indo-European Latins, over the pre-existing population by this time is absurd, right? But there was surely a separation between, the freeman who could afford an equipment to go to war by himself, and the rest of laborers that broke their backs in the fields and provided for the elite, right? So there is here actually we don't know how the process happened, and we will have to analyze it in other videos, at least the hypothesis that we know about it. So, hence a social classification and a distribution of the political rights based on wealth. This is a democratic system. And this is in fact how the Serbian reform distinguished 5 classes of citizens. So the first one comprehended those who possessed a capital of at least 100,000 asses. The second one, those that possessed 75,000 asses. The third, 50,000 asses. The fourth, 25,000. And the fifth, 11,000 asses. And the interesting aspect about these numbers is that, in fact, they do not correspond at all to the economical conditions of the time, right? When, that the asses were a unit of measurement that was introduced later. By the 5th century, actually by the end of the 6th century, where the Serbian times actually would have happened, but for the 5th, generally speaking, where they would have been in force, the wealth was evaluated in land plots, the jugera, right, and on heads of cattle, the pecunia, right, hence pecus, that means herd, then that later would instead mean the money, right? But that tells you, how powerful this tribal past was, for even more recent times of Roman expansion. And the measurement of wealth in asses would have been established, and according to this basis, not before the 2nd century BC, right? So this is obviously like an invention of sort, and even the amount of wealth actually doesn't correspond to what would have been available by the 6th or the 5th century BC. But the vision of Roman historiography is that with the Serbian reform triumphs a sort of census system, a democratic system, that, by the way, the Romans of the 1st century BC were somewhat modeling out of Clisthenes' reform in Athens, right? And so, because they wanted to show, for reasons we have commented on the last video on the Roman Archaic combat, that there was some, proximity to, not between the Greeks and the Romans as peoples, but rather on the political and institutional achievements, right, of the Romans, especially, that absolutely didn't go through that like the Athenians did. But the important here is that the Serbian system was seen as having expressed politically itself in the institutions of the Comitia Centuriata that we will talk about later, and also, and very importantly, because this is connected to all thing, a new military organization, right? State is created primarily for self-defense reasons that must be paid for by the community, right? That, in this sense, creation of a central government, of a tax collection system, and of an army, right? Even a semi-permanent, and as we will see, because Rome literally from the 4th century BC at least begins to expand, and it doesn't stop until it has conquered the whole world, literally. So this thing, however it happened, it was most evidently aimed at a military function, right? And we haven't addressed on Schwerpunkt ever all the process of expansion of Rome during the 4th century. We will have to do it. We have instead talked mostly about the Serbian and / Camillian reform. And in fact, many people said, no, because they're two separate things. Yeah, you wished they were. If you follow the traditional historiography, you do. But if you look at concrete history, there is no evidence properly of this having happened. This is very important because up to the end of the 5th and beginning of the 4th century BC, in spite of whichever Etruscan influence had existed in here, Rome is ruled by these private clans, right? It's a feudal society. right? It has integrated many other groups, but still the military clans that rule. So what about the Serbian reform of the Roman army? Actually, when I made the video, because we made also a video about the Serbian reform of the Roman army, I don't think I made all these premises, right, about what, actually I tell it like the traditional way. I don't even hint at this switch between, to chameleon reform. So it's also an old video, and probably we'll have to do it again, to make it again, because I don't want even to create misunderstandings in general, and it's obvious that I know a bit more about these things now than I did in the past, but anyhow, the essentials I think are explained, but manualistically speaking. And that's in fact, this is the problem, and also why I make these videos, because in normal Roman history books, you still find this, like, at the end of the 6th century, Servius Tullius made this reform, and therefore the Romans fought that, but it didn't never existed. It never existed, right? The best history, manuals do not. I mean, they at least hint at the fact that this thing is traditionally recorded to have happened, but it didn't quite, right? But rarely, in fact, a Roman history manual actually goes a bit more in depth to the thing and saying, look, this is a traditional version, but at least I tell you how, it said what we really noted. It's just usually the traditional version, and that's it. And that's why people keep repeating this stuff, and they just keep alive the tale, right? However, the Serbian reform, so Livy stresses pretty well the parallelism between the civil and military rights and duties. So each of the 5 citizen classes was subdivided into centuriae, the centuries, groups of allegedly 100 men, of whom half would have had to serve as the actual troops in the army, right? And these were the juniores, the younger, between they were subdivided originally in age, right? Later on in Roman history, like if you look at the manipular reform, it's by democratic sense proper, even at this level. The ages between 17 and 46, while the other, as a reserve, the seniores, between 46 and 60 years old. And the armament and supplies were all to be paid by the individuals, right? And this is actually a complicated thing to even point out, because as soon as there was a state organization, there was naturally a system of distribution of weaponry and supplies, and we know it from the Siege of Veii, right? So it's funny when people say, Marius was the first one who, at the end of the 2nd century BC began to give a pay to the soldiers and to produce equipment for them, right? Yeah, because do you think that in the meanwhile Rome had conquered the Mediterranean just with a guy that brought together with itself all his military equipment, and even some cheese or meat for the whole campaign, and that's how it had always worked. Actually, it began, in fact, in this very period, by the end of the 5th, the beginning of 4th century BC, and naturally, it wasn't still kind of a fully regularized system, but we, at least the armies that we start seeing used by Rome by the 3rd century BC are already, obviously, the consuls were given a certain amount of money for which they had to buy the supplies, the equipment, to provide for the troops, and of course these people were to provide at least part of the equipment. The weapon was an important thing, but the system, the more the Romans began to serve, out of receipt for longer times, the more the thing passes from materialism to professionalism, right? In a military sense, at least at the legionary level, because the clan leaders and their families were full military professionals in the feudal sense, but it's obvious that they couldn't provide their own equipment by themselves throughout the whole campaign, and naturally there were complicated systems that show the rise, the construction properly of a military administration, and this Roman, what will become the most efficient and effective branch of the Roman state, the military, as it will always remain throughout Roman history, after all. And consider that, just generally speaking, like the major expanses of the state throughout all ancient history and beyond, it's obviously and overwhelmingly the military ones. What do you think states existed for? Like for building civil stuff, that thing went on by itself largely, right? Unless they were, big infrastructures. But, the overwhelming majority, crushing majority of expanses of a state were exclusively military. But obviously, right, just think how, in fact, well, let's not digress further, but just think about even the means of enforcement at this point of even of taxes and how it worked. I mean, Roman taxes, in percentage terms, were extremely low to today, right? Naturally, for the time, they were very high as well, but we're talking about very different realities. So, from this system of recruitment, two consequences derived. First of all, there was an amount of Roman citizenry, of proper freemen, that were excluded from the military service, right? Those people who declared a census inferior to the 11,000 asses, and these were known as the capite censi, that is literally those who are counted and do not possess else but their own head in this regard, and these were naturally freemen, right? This is important to stress because the slaves were excluded instead by the military service, because they didn't have a right or a duty to do it. They were slaves. They were non-freemen. They were not part of their citizenry, of course, right? And nobody would have ever dreamt to arm them, if not in moments of of emergency, as it happened on some occasion. And also, the freedmen and the citizens that had been deprived of their own civil rights were naturally excluded by the army, right? So consider that ideally, naturally, this idea of serving in the army is, especially in the tribal world, and then romantically still in this time, like a duty, but also a privilege. Like if you are a freeman, you can participate to you should be proud. You can go out there and defend your fatherland and from the enemies, etc. Right? And I don't think at the beginning of this time the situation was that different from reality. As we've seen, Rome was threatened literally from everybody. It would remain so for up to the beginning of the 3rd century BC in Italy even. So this system was fueled by interests that, after all, engaged the collectivity, right? Even the plebeians in this regard struggled for having this right of participating to the army. It was an enormous deal, right? And they had a lot to benefit from indirectly. Think about the the expansion of the Roman markets to the conquests, the new slaves, the new possessions that were eventually ideally at least distributed among the winners. Then eventually that the oligarchy always maintains the privilege over this, and it basically distributes very few, or at least says something, because the agere publicus was shared in this sense, like whoever can, like sometimes there were distributions, but most of the times it was like whoever can occupy it can do it, right? Then theoretically the state can take it back, but basically the state were the richer people who could occupy more land, and even knock out this still stateless world, even those who inhabited there, doing the same Roman citizens. And this is also what brought to the military crisis of the 2nd century BC, but it probably began at certain levels since now. Just to say, as we were saying before, that the Roman elite, these clan leaders, weren't like substituted by another ruling class. They were always the same in many ways, even those who created this popular army and commanded it, however. And the military service, the militia, right, was, as we said, was at meantime a right and a privilege of the active citizens. It was integrated in the community. And on the other hand, within this city army, right, citizen army, the rights and duties varied according to the class, that is, according to the wealth, right? And that would remain very important within Roman society, because there was essentially a monopoly of the higher class over the rest, right? In the first class, there were, for example, 18 centuriae of knights and 80 centuriae of the infantrymen armed at their own expenses of offensive and defensive arms. In the following three classes, there were 20 centuriae of lightly armed infantrymen, were added 2 centuriae of pioneers and 2 musicians. In the fifth class provided 30 centuriae of men armed with slings. So aside from the fact that, you know, the first are better equipped, but they're better equipped because they're also wealthier, more powerful in the city, right? So actually the first class was the strongest one, and the one that had a heavier importance in not just on the field, but in fact in the political and institutional system. And this would gradually increase actually the disparity between these classes, because naturally the classes over time began to fit different categories, and even the age thing, they won't be so much importance compared to the wealth differences and so on. Since the Capita Censi were also reunited in a single centuriae, you actually obtain 193 centuriae that are probably combat units, in which the first class occupies the most preeminent position that is to be found in the political organization. So the wealthier guys with the best equipment, right? So this shows you how oligarchic this army still concretely was. Yes, the rest of the people up to a certain amount of wealth that included even guys equipped with slings was included, but basically these people were still not at the same level of the others. We're still under, right? And this is in many ways the beautiful thing, because theoretically, after the Tarquinians fell, the Republic was instated, all the Republican regime, and this values of equality, not as whole. Roman society remained deeply and unavoidably and normally for the times were oligarchic, and there was no other way for that specific society to change like that. Just Athens could do that in most radical forms of democracy. To the point, they obviously failed, as they always fail. But they, Rome was not like a city in the way we mean it, like properly the Republican democratic sense of the picture, right? It was something extremely different. So, in passing to the political organization proper, so since the centuria was both a combat and vote unit, it's clear that the first class, with its 98 centuriae, detained truly the absolute majority. As a consequence, the comitia centuriata were dominated by the wealthier, and the Servian organization presents this sense of, markedly a democratic character, both for its political and military implications. And there are, however, two aspects to point out that kind of smooth the thing a little. First of all, there's the existence of the patricians, that is this sort of hereditary nobility of the clans that reserved for self the exercise of the higher religious functions, as much as the usage of the land, and provides to the army his the bulk of its force, and leaves surrounded by clients that their patrons protect in exchange for an oath of fealty, the fides, right? And to make an example, when the gens of the Claudi were one of the most powerful and aristocratic, they were actually of of Sabine origin, not of Latin origin, but they came to dominate the system pretty damned well, right? According the Claudi rise to a level of preeminence in Rome, like they were called properly from the outside, in the very sense, I can say in the same way that it was done for the Tarquinians, but they are called by the Roman nobility after the fall of the Tarquinians to compensate a little bit for that gap that the fall of the Etruscans had brought, and to shelter Rome from, if we can't fight against everybody, at least let's bring someone in so that we can be temporarily stronger. So the Claudian family, the gens Claudia, left Sabine, the Sabina, in order to come living, in fact, within the Roman territory, right? And according to the sources, it would have migrated together with 5,000 clients, right? This is not a few. These are actually a lot of Sabines that enter this Latin city of Rome. And the second element, is the power of the Etruscan monarchy that reduces considerably the political powers of the Centuriae Assembly, that essentially was a military one, right? At least this is the aspect that we have to stress, that these clans all had their own councils. They had their little senates in many ways. So what at least the later Roman historiography attributed to Servian reform was the idea that there was a sort of compaction of the decision of the political and military decisional process. These councils, private councils, were, for example, assembled at the sound of the trumpet. They were actually employed even to back the political power in a way, support the king, call up for war, and sharing the loot, right? So that's the clanic feudal character we're talking about. So there is this element in which the Roman oligarchy comes a bit more together, right? And there are more powerful families, probably also under the Etruscan times, have become more powerful, and now can, even in part exploit this, feeble level, but still important level of centralization of sort. And this accentuation of the military aspect in the political life in this royal times, in the age of kings, seems to have characterized the Etruscan domination as well, right? Especially towards its end, under the last king, Tarquinius, the superb, right? Was called to power according to the older sources, according to actually a violent upheaval, an overthrow, right? And that was eventually what triggered, this is at least a negative stigma on the second Tarquinius, and saying, okay, well, he was, as we will see now, with the fall of this Etruscan domination, how the Romans justified historiographically the passage to the Republic. But probably, even if it can definitely contain some aspects of truth, it still shows a world that doesn't quite function like a state in the way we would imagine it, right? And that's why most of the changes that we attribute to the Servian reform actually happened very gradually in later times, after actually the Tarquinian Rome, and in a very different, also political and could say international in that sense, in central Italy, context. So the Roman historiography justified the overthrow of kings by stilicizing Tarquinius as a Greek tyrant, right? From the late, the Hellenic historiography of the 1st century BC. So he rose to power allegedly by using force, which actually, it's plausible, right? But against the will of the patres, right, of the patricians, and especially being supported by the lower classes, by the people, right? Therefore, he was stilized literally as a Greek demagogue, which was what the Romans, even in the Republican era, were utterly disgusted by, and that would have, in fact, in Rome, never quite seen. And he was also depicted as an impious man. So there had to be the full justification of overthrowing, after all, important institution of the monarchy had been started by Romulus himself, right? For example, Tarquinius had impeded the burial of Servius Tullius. So actually the cool guy of the story, as you understand, that had done so much for Rome, and Tarquinius didn't even wanted to bury him. That was an outrage, right? There was an outrage against the deities, right? And that was absolutely inconceivable, because in the ancient world every single thing is dictated by religion, right? Let's also put aside any form of attempting, like it was done in the Enlightenment, or even by the nation state in the 19th century, that these were, by any stretch of the imagination, anything like lay or modern or secular, whatever you want to call it. The ancient world, and the whole world, it was exclusively based, as we have seen, on religion. There was no other way of thinking reality outside of religion, by definition, right? So Tarquinius' action was simply an enormous crime and a sacrilege. From Livy, this is quite clear. And afterwards, Tarquinius' behavior had further accentuated his tyrannic character, that also the ancient authors didn't miss the opportunity to force. His contemporaries were the Pisistratids of Athens. So this is all modeled out of Athenian history, and naturally has nothing to do with the reality of Rome. But for example, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, let's remember, rise in 1st century BC as well, denounced as tyrannical acts a list of Tarquinius' achievements. Let's say the first one was the creation of an armed bodyguard, right? That was composed by Romans and foreigners that, according to the author, procured to Tarquinius a continuous security from all the ambushes that could be set to him. So just imagine the context, like the idea, of course, that now this sounds like a sophisticated political assassination, but at the time it was literally these clans kind of acting like bands of thugs, and clashing against each other in the streets of this city. Was yet to be, must have been fantastic to see, like 5th century Rome. What would you give to see that? It was me extremely fascinating. Which is, in a way, that Roman magistrates had their own bodyguards as well. So this thing was maybe, more stilized for a Dionysius of Halicarnassus than maybe for a Livy, right? But that's, in fact, where we're stressing the Hellenic parallelism. The second act was the hostility towards the Roman aristocracy and his kind of inwards behaviors, his contempt or fear for the public dimension, his way of dealing with the affairs of state, like alone or with some private counselor to whom were reserved his favors. This is very important in the ancient world, both in the Hellenic, but possibly even more in the Roman world, like this idea of that life was to be lived publicly, right? Every political act was a matter of, of public business, right? And the idea of not sharing, of not declaring, directly, frankly, the political intentions, and trying to deprive the people of the participation, right? The people here meant as the Roman aristocracy, as you understand in practice, was naturally an accusation of tyranny, but this is something like, in fact, a Greek of the 1st century BC could see the thing after his own experience. in 5th century BC Rome, this is kind of highly unlikely to have happened, right? Where would he go, right? Would you think that was even just, in palaces where there is a share of, a dimension of the public and a dimension of the private? There were political and military balances that were evident to everybody, everywhere in the city, right? So then there is the desire of Tarquinius to intertwine personal ties with other families, but also foreign ones. So, having, in this sense, a kind of a private business with, with the clans, etc. And that's literally what was normal at the time, in that sense. But also with foreign powers. So, with the threat, at least for Rome in this regard, which is that it was probably a risk at the time as well. Also, his attention to grow the splendor of Rome through a policy of great works that would tie him to the needy lower classes, so making this demagogic policy to the lower strata of the population that were like kind of unvirtuous, and they weren't like the Roman patres, the nobility that knew what was better, right? And actually I quite agree with that, because I believe that, of course, even the people, the plebs that emerges in the political struggle, they're not like, an average shoemaker. Like, these were people like wealthy merchants, people who had big business and that counted in the city and so on. So that's how it would remain also largely in Roman history. But there is the total excess, which is famously and hopefully just a legend, of the rape of the Roman noblewoman Lucretia, right? That, according to the older sources, would have pushed to the extreme the hostility of the Roman aristocracy and determined their revolt, guided by Lucius Junius Brutus, that, according to Tacitus, established the freedom, the liberty, that's at least in Roman terms, and the consulship, right? And that's how allegedly, like, the story, Lucretia killed herself after the rape. So this is an extremely dramatic situation. There is the revolt. Tarquinius is overthrown. He flees Rome. And there is all a deep kind of sacral symbolism to this, because Lucretia's rape is naturally symbolizing here something that went beyond naturally measure, but also was properly a threat to the Roman aristocracy, like crime specifically aimed at diminishing the value of Roman aristocracy, right? And this is naturally the best reason for getting out of the tyrant by the same oligarchs. And in spite of Tacitus, we gotta admit that Lucius Junius Brutus is a completely invented character. He has nothing to do with the expulsion of the Tarquinians, and that, as we have seen before, is connected to the decline of the Etruscan power, the awakening of the Italic peoples, and of internal movements in the colonies of Magna Graecia, and, for example, the destruction of Siberia, and is contemporary to the overthrow of the Tarquinians. Tarquinius leaves Rome because of the intervention of the king of Clusium, Porsen, that would eventually threaten Rome himself. So you see here, after the fall of the Tarquinians, there are other powers that try to fill the gap, the same Etruscans and other peoples. And this is datable around 509, 508. And Tarquinius fled first to Tusculum, right? And he died in Cumae in 495. The news of his death was acclaimed in Rome, etc. And regarding to the alleged birth of the Republic, this was, according to historiography, sort of decision of the aristocracy, of the patriciate of Rome, against a foreign and tyrannic domination that may have happened, surely not before 504 BC, and more likely after 480, 475 BC, right? So here, once again, the timeline is all kind of very, imaginative, but still, it might have taken place in this sense, and there is afterwards that process, this attempt from the side of Rome to counter the the invasion of other peoples. After all, both Tacitus and Cicero before him stated the same thing, and we must assess that at least for the Romans, of the first century BC, the Republican liberty, res publica, and the libertas are basically synonyms at that point, in that for the Age of Kings, they concentrate especially in the last phase, and especially relatively to the tyrannic and foreign character of the last king. So the Roman historiography of the first century BC was naturally portraying something that was inconceivable in the Roman political and institutional reality of their times, and that they all despise as a paradigm that everybody would know was ridiculous. That is, Rome being ruled by a foreign king. What the hell? We are a republic of Romans. We conquered the world. But at that point, so this was definitely the best kind of figure, like the idea of imagine a weak and corrupted kind of Hellenic-styled, king, a tyrant that would even profane the Roman religion and Roman women, right? That's the best villain for historiographical fiction in the first century BC Rome. And it was definitely a political slogan for their own times, because naturally the Roman Republic was over almost. The deep hatred for the monarchy was to fuel the Republican rhetoric that would go against Caesar, and that even Octavian will be able to cope with very, very cleverly. And so there is this reality, the first moments of Roman history that are connected to the Etruscan phase, of which a very few survives, if not maybe from a urban point of view, which is very, very important anyway, but also the Serbian walls, for example, are much later. There is definitely an evident Etruscan influence in Rome, but the problem is we can't see really how the whole thing happened aside from historiography probe, right? We are literally making these comparisons with things that happened in parallel, how the Romans could still say, because we know nothing about this. There would be another aspect that, as we stressed before, is extremely important, that is religion, that we'll see another time. But for now we stop and we just stress the necessity of considering all of this history just as a historiographical construction that definitely contained some sparks of truth, right? And that more than else make us see what that world could be from people that definitely are much closer temporally to that one and culturally to that one, but not much historically. That is to say, today we have a much more precise idea of what Rome was than what Livy had, because we do it thanks to Livy and other authors, but also to a lot of other things that they didn't use at the time, like even just archaeologically speaking. So they knew also a lot that we don't know that would have been extremely useful, but still we have to realize that that was a very different era from today in terms of just of historiographical, I would say essence, because it goes even beyond method, or it's simply realizing what should history serve for. Like, it's not that the Romans have here fully even adopted the the more kind of rationalistic and properly, historical taste of the Greeks. After all, they still leave their story like a saga, right? Where there were these heroes that fought those battles, that stood for those principles, and that get that thing set. But that is not properly what happened, but what they thought, and they I can say they hoped, but they truly believed, I presume, that actually happened, and that they were surely adding something on their own to it, but still they probably drew from this deep conviction of what now that existed now in their own in the way it had become, that couldn't contemplate in this sense much of a different picture, and that in this sense offers us much more positive historical evidence in itself about their own times, but even the past ones, of which after all something they understood even. But that was definitely very different from what you're searching for, as if you were reading like a modern history. That's not what it is, right? And we'll come back on these topics hopefully soon. Just it was totally random, as you know, that in the last months we talked about this stuff, but we have a lot to add naturally, and I hope we will do it. We'll do it soon. For now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.